Well, hello and welcome to the first of our spring 2023 Kessler Conversations, a series entitled Printed Text and Hypertext, Technological and Social Change. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library here at Emory University, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. These Kessler Conversations are opportunities to interview leading scholars in the early modern period to help us understand what the books, the conversations, and the figures of the 16th century might teach communities in the 21st century. I'm thrilled to welcome today as our guest, Dr. Andrew Pettegree. Dr. Pettegree is professor of modern history at the University of St. Andrews. He is the author of 15 books, many of which defined the field in areas of Reformation history and the history of communication. Titles familiar to many of you may include his 2010 Yale University Press book, The Book in the Renaissance, his 2015 public Penguin book, Brand Luther, which, by the way, is my go-to recommendation when anyone asks for a book on the Reformation, and his most recent 2021 book, which is certainly near and dear to my heart, The Library of Fragile History, co-authored with Arthur der Weduwen. Professor Pettegree's next book, entitled The Book at War, will be published in October of 2023. Amongst all of this scholarship, he also happens to be the director of the Universal Short Title Catalogue, the USTC, which is an online bibliography of all books published in the first 2 centuries after Gutenberg's introduction of movable type into Europe. Now, when I think about the cultural and social history of the Reformation, of technological innovations that both created the context for, but also grew out of the reforms of the 16th century, I think of Andrew Pettegree's work. And so I'm so thankful that he's taken the time to join us today. So Dr. Pettegree, thank you in advance for being here.
Very great pleasure to be with you all.
So I want to remind our audience here that you can participate. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so if you have questions throughout our conversation, please type them in there. And then assuming we have time at the end, I will relay them to Dr. Pettegree at the end of our conversation. But I'm going to start with a big, broad question, as I often do, just to get the conversation going. So in the title of your talk today, and in many of your publications, you speak of Martin Luther and his use of the media. Now, I personally don't, and I suspect many of us don't generally associate the word media with the religious and cultural reforms of the 16th century. So can you help us understand what you mean by labeling Martin Luther as a media man?
Well, it's a fair question, but I would say that as long as people have talked, written, and traveled, it's legitimate to talk about that as media. The hunger for news, I think, is intrinsic to humanity, and the news environment of Luther's day was every bit as busy and diverse as today. And I think that's one of the characteristics of media generally, that you have a multimedia society. The problem, until shortly before Luther was working and writing, was that high quality news was only available to people at the very top of society. Essentially, 3 groups could get news. Princes, because they had their diplomatic networks, international merchants, because they had their agents abroad writing back to them, and the church at all levels, because churchmen are always on the move from one house to another or on pilgrimage. So Luther, being a churchman, was actually part of one of the best news networks in Europe. And he would have made very great use of those networks to get his news and to perform his duties as the local boss of a couple of religious houses. But the capacity to move beyond those groups really only comes with the invention of printing in the 15th century, around 1450. But even then, print is making its way in a crowded market. You've got correspondence, you've got word of mouth, you've got town criers, you've got gossip, singing, all different ways of conveying news and opinion. And what Luther did to add to that through his pamphlets was genuinely, in my view, revolutionary and original.
No, that's really helpful to set the stage. And of course, your work is to highlight how innovatively Luther uses the media and how he changes, as you say, revolutionizes media at the time. You point to, I think it's a really helpful example in Brand Luther, the 1518 sermon on indulgences and grace. You call it, quote, a work of intuitive genius, noting, and a longer quote here, Luther replaces the 95 theses propositions with 20 short paragraphs, each developing a single aspect of the question. None is more than 3 or 4 sentences long. The sentences are direct. The whole work is a mere 1,500 words. It fits perfectly into an 8-page pamphlet. This was a revolution in theological writing. Luther, in contrast to the age of the sermon as a theatrical event, had produced a sermon that could be read or read aloud in 10 minutes and still engage the heart of the question. So I think that nicely shows that early on in his career, he's really changing the game in terms of media. So while oftentimes, particularly in this library, we focus on Luther as a theological reformer, which leads us to think about the content of what he's publishing, you're pointing us toward his reformation of the form of theological dialogue. Mm-hmm. So where does this revolutionary idea of change come from, and what impact does the shift in form have on the way theological debate occurs during and after Luther's life?
Well, I think that's a very important question, and probably one of the most important questions of the Reformation. Because until this time, theological debate was virtually a clerical monopoly. It was a discussion between church people in Latin. And so how did Luther, who was extremely talented, but instinctively rather conservative, and approaching a comfortable middle age without having made any impact in the print world, how did he have this blinding revelation of the power of print? It's a big question and a very good one. Until this point in 1517, and then in 1518 with the Sermon on Indulgence and Grace in German, which is the revolutionary point, he published virtually nothing, and what he published had made very little impact. But what I think you can say is that Luther was fascinated with the technology. There was one print shop in Wittenberg, not a very efficient one, didn't produce very good work, but it was very close to where he lived, and his had a good relationship with the rather snoozy old printer there. So he was interested in the technology. And I think here not enough is made of his background. Luther's father was a mining entrepreneur. He was an industrialist, if you like, and that's a very unusual background for an intellectual in the 16th century. And so Luther was brought up in a household that lived through technology. That's what put bread on the table, and he knew everything about that technology. And it's a relatively short step between copper mining, which is what his dad did, and movable type. So I think the interest in print and his understanding of print comes from those contexts. How did he find his easy colloquial style? That's a second big question here. And I think that's because you have to remember that Luther was not only a professor and taught in the university in Latin, but he was giving his sermons to the only congregation in Wittenberg. There was only one parish church in Wittenberg, so there was no competition. And of course, when you're giving a sermon, you're standing up physically above your congregation. You can see if they're following or if they're tuned out. And I think he wanted to be a good father to his flock. And that meant preaching in a style understandable to the audience. And that's what comes through so clearly in his early German pamphlets. It's the preacher with an easy colloquial style of language.
Yeah, it's you point to Wittenberg as an important understanding the place, and I think that's so essential to us. I mean, Wittenberg, of course, is on our map because of Luther, but as you notice, or as you mentioned, it really wasn't much of a well-known town at the time. I watched you give a talk at Harvard Divinity School where you talked about the printing in Europe at the time, and you identified the kind of 12 major centers of production, and of them you say it's, quote, a world that should have had no place for little Wittenberg. So tell us a little bit about the town as Luther, when he starts, and then what economic and cultural impact the figure Luther and his work has on the place.
Yeah. Well, if you visit Wittenberg, and it's a great visit because the fingerprint of the footprint of the old town is very much as it was when Luther left it. Renaissance mansions, very sturdy buildings in the center of town. And the streets you walk with those beautiful houses were the town that Luther made. It wasn't what it was like when he arrived, rather unwillingly, to serve in the new university there. He'd been forced to leave far more sophisticated centers, like Erfurt, when he was delegated to go and teach in Wittenberg. In an early letter home, he said if he'd gone a little further than Wittenberg, he would have been among the barbarians. That is right at the extent of civilization in North Germany, and he'd been up to the great empty plains of the southern Baltic lands. But by 1521, through his works, this obscure professor was suddenly one of the most famous men in Germany. And as a result, students and converts to his movement flocked to Wittenberg to listen to him, to sit at his feet, to be in his classes, and those of his very capable lieutenants like Philip Melanchthon. As a result, little Wittenberg, 2,000 inhabitants, none of them very rich, was suddenly booming. And so the citizens and innkeepers started putting extra stories on their houses to take in lodgers. And then there was a rebuilding of wooden houses in stone. And this was all through Luther. And then there was a publishing industry. So you basically got a city which becomes a one industry town, and that is education. Either the physical education of the students who've arrived or publishing to spread the word. In 1517, there was just one publishing house, very small, incapable of sophisticated work. But by 1526, encouraged by Luther, and sometimes directly recruited by Luther, he actually went to Leipzig to bring back a printer with him. There were 5 separate publishing houses, and they had the books everyone wanted. Everyone wanted these books from Wittenberg. And so much so that more established places of publishing, like Augsburg and Nuremberg, sometimes put Wittenberg on their front cover in order to associate themselves with the brand. And this is why I called my book Brand Luther, because the branding was so important. So everybody got rich from Martin Luther and his works, which is one other reason why he was one of the best respected and best liked people in the town.
Well, I don't want to offer any offense to the scholars who are joining us, but it's hard to imagine a scholar having that cultural and economic impact on a single place. Yeah, it's quite remarkable. And you mentioned the kind of the attempts to create Wittenberg-like works from the other places. I know your colleague Drew Thomas has done a lot of work on this
fantastic work.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of impact, from a distance, obviously, of 500 years, we see the impact of Luther's theology and rhetoric on, these big church reforms. But I think in the context of the 16th century, it's hard to understand the sheer commercial and cultural impact that he had, as you've alluded to. Oftentimes you'll see stats like, maybe up to 20% of all published works during his lifetime were Luther publications. But you've argued that this relationship is not quite as simple as it seems. If I could quote from an article you wrote, quote, "The synergy of print and Protestantism is not as obvious as it might appear. This was a relationship that had to be crafted." So just how big of a commercial success was Luther, and what role did this commercial success play in the impact of his theological program?
Well, his works were extremely successful. You can tell that by not only the fact that they were reprinted so often, but the extent to which printers who printed Luther were able to go on and buy bigger houses. There's a very good index of German printers in the 16th century, which not only gives you their known productivity and their life events, but also when they bought and sold property. So you can see them on an upward trajectory to bigger houses, better houses. At one point, his friend Lucas Cranach, who we'll come on to, had 7 houses in Wittenberg. So he was doing quite well out of the Luther industry. But you could also see in places that didn't permit the printing of Luther, desperate printers selling up and moving to less salubrious parts of town. For instance, in Leipzig, where the authorities forbade the publication of Lutheran. And Leipzig had been a major center, one of the largest centers of printing in Europe before the Reformation. And in these circumstances, it just withered away. And so the printers went to the Duke and said, look, Duke, we just cannot make money at the moment publishing Catholic books. So, help us out here.
Well, let me follow up. I mean, you also happen, as I mentioned, to be the director of the USTC project. And so perhaps nobody better than you has a sense of how this plays out beyond Luther's lifetime. And so if we look at the success of the publishing industry around Wittenberg as one indication of Luther's impact, what happens after Luther's life? Does that tail off? And then can we make a comparable conclusion that he becomes less impactful because the sales maybe go down?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for mentioning the Universal Short Title Catalogue. If people joining us don't know about it, you just need to type into any browser USTC, and you'll either get us or the Technological University of China. So if you get China first, we're lower down the page, but still, persevere, and it's free to use for anyone throughout the world. At the moment, we study the entirety of print from 1450 to 1650, the first 2 centuries of print. That's about 840,000 different editions. And we're in the process of putting up all the data from 1651 to 1700, which will double the size of it. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. And if you just look at the totality of print and then limit by date between 1450 and 1517, you'll see that if you look down at the facets to the top authors, you'll see that they're all dead, or almost all of them are dead, because the printing industry is so conservative that it just turns out lots of Cicero, lots of medieval theologians, and it's a very difficult time for living authors to make a living. That's why authors all love Erasmus so much, because Erasmus was the first to be really monetize his talent. We'll come on to Luther and money a little bit later. But if you then do a different search, not 1450 to 1517, but 1450 to 1521, you'll see Luther is suddenly the most published author in the history of print. And it's an astonishing transformation in those 4 or 5 years, really remarkable. Now, and if you then think to yourself, well, is this sustainable? He dies in 1546. It is, because when the first pamphlet deluge of the 1520s dried up, people needed Bibles, they needed psalm books, they needed church ordinances, they needed devotional literature of all other sorts. And so Wittenberg did not just recede back into the background, but even in the 1590s, as you can see in the Universal Short Title Catalogue, it was topping the polls as the most important publishing place in Germany. So yes, if you go on now to look into the 17th century, the number of editions of Luther being published goes down. So is he losing influence? Well, not necessarily, because if you then look at the auction catalogues of people's private collections of books, you see then that they don't need the same quantity of new editions, because they're being resold from one collection to another. So in this respect, production figures tell us a lot, but they don't tell us everything. And by this point, we've had the complete works of Luther published in 2 rival editions, one in Jena and one in Wittenberg. And so these are very valuable books, and no one's going to throw them out when their owners die. So the second-hand market helps perpetuate Luther's influence.
Well, I was going to say, when I think about our own collection, and one thing you notice is a lot of rebinding of Luther in these later centuries. And so obviously the books are being used, being resold, and you can trace provenance of them throughout. So yeah, what we think of as the used book market, it's still a very valuable market, suggests he's still influential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, just to come back to an earlier question you asked about, why was this association between Protestantism and the book it's sort of assumed? I think it's partly because his early opponents made a strategic error, which was entirely understandable. Because for Luther's opponents, the best way of dealing with him was minimum publicity and then have him just quietly put away somewhere. So I would say that Luther was in the position where they wouldn't reply to him in the vernacular. So the vernacular was his. And then in another, strategic error of massive proportions, the Paris University Theological Faculty, the Sorbonne, banned translations of the Bible. So basically it ceded the Bible as a Protestant book. And that was difficult to recover that ground. But on the other hand, I found when I did some work on France, that because Paris and its printers and its preachers were very loyal to Catholicism, this enabled France to put in a very, very effective fight back in print, because by that point, Catholic theologians had realized they had to talk in the vernacular if they wanted to keep these their congregations from being tempted by Protestantism. So it's the predominance of Protestantism is really a phenomenon of the first generation. But by that time, a lot of damage has been done to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of back to your point about using the term media, you can think about all kinds of modern parallels of how do you deal with new voices? Do you meet them on their own terms? Yeah, we won't get into that, but yeah, lots of interesting parallels. So you've mentioned a couple of times the folks with whom Luther was working, right? The people on his side in Wittenberg. And you spent a lot of time, particularly in Brand Luther, talking about this. You have a whole chapter called Luther's Friends. And you say, even though sometimes we think about Luther, as we often do, as kind of the lone genius, and that was kind of a curated image itself through woodcut images at the time, you say, quote, had Luther been such a solitary figure, the man alone, the voice crying in the wilderness, his Reformation would have quickly died. So amongst the many key partners with whom Luther worked, you talk specifically about Lucas Cranach, who we've mentioned before. You call him, quote, one of the rocks on which the Wittenberg Reformation would be built. So please, if you can, tell us a little bit about Cranach. You already mentioned his many houses, but talk about who he was and how he and Luther worked together to create this thing that you're calling a brand Luther, and how important is someone like Cranach to Luther's success?
That's very important. But before I go to Cranach, I just want to give a shout out to Philip Melanchthon, who was his first lieutenant and, in Luther's view, a far superior mind to his own, and certainly a more trained mind. And so Melanchthon was the person who systemized the Reformation, sometimes not entirely to Luther's satisfaction, but he was responsible for this theological framework of what became a movement. Then you have Johannes Bugenhagen, who was the great church organizer, again, a very important role once it was clear Protestantism would survive, and there had to be a thing called Protestantism. As for Cranach, he was the great image maker of the Reformation, responsible for a whole new school of Protestant art. He was one of Germany's most distinguished painters, second only in reputation to Albrecht Dürer. He'd been lured north to Wittenberg to act as the court painter to the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. And unlike Dürer, he was also highly capable and innovative businessman. And he built a large workshop factory. It's a huge building. You can see it in the main square at Wittenberg even now. And so he could turn out not only paintings, but items for the printing press. He was occasionally a printer himself, but mostly supplied woodcuts to the other printers. And he was fascinated by Luther. He would have heard him preach like every other citizen, and he became an early ally. In due course, when Luther got married, they were godparents to each other's children, so they were very close. And it was he who created the influential woodcut images of Luther, which were sold separately and in massive numbers. Sometimes they were more expressive than words. These beautiful pictures by Cranach of the determined young monk standing with just the book as protection against the papacy and all the cardinals and all the wiles of Rome, as German people thought of them. And he also created the rather beautiful title page designs, which went round the title itself and gave Luther's movement such a sort of visual distinctiveness. Now, having such beautiful images on pamphlets was a new thing. Pamphlets were thought of as being throwaway. So these were very short works often, but also beautifully adorned. It was like giving the Reformation a livery. And this is the work that the scholar that Bo's already mentioned, Drew Thomas, has done, tracing the use of facsimiles and copies of these woodcut borders around other places of publication where they were ruthlessly ripped off by other printers because they were selling. This is what was the visual identifier of something supporting Luther's movement. And so Cranach was enormously important, not least because, let's remember, Wittenberg was a small town. It didn't have a patrician merchant elite like Nuremberg would, or Augsburg or Strasbourg, which meant that self-made men could rise to the very top of local society. So Cranach was a councillor and sometime burgomaster. Other members of the publishing industry followed into the town council. So they could offer local protection for Luther and ensure that he wasn't harassed in any way. And they also relied on him for his judgments on legal cases as well. So it was an incredibly productive relationship between the two of them.
And I'll say even today, when we have student groups and kids coming in to look at the Reformation collection, all you have to do is show some Cranach woodcuts from the Passional Christi or from the September Testament to see that these artists are participating in the theological program just as much as the guy writing the book. So yeah, it's quite stunning. So we talked a little bit about the printing business in the 16th century. You've alluded to, and in your works, you certainly highlight how difficult a business that was, that a single print run could sink any publisher. Quote from that article I referenced earlier, quote, "For most early printers, the experimental age would end in bankruptcy." Luther, of course, is an anomaly here in that he sold like wildfire. And so with all of his popularity, it would stand to reason that Luther was successful himself and made a lot of money off his publications. So how would you characterize Luther's understanding of economics of printing, and how well did his success translate into financial stability and success for the Luther family?
Yeah. No, the early bankruptcies to which Bo refers was a very unexpected thing. Printers went into the business expecting that this fantastic new invention, which everyone seemed to be interested in, would make them money. But the sort of books they produced, which were mainly big and in Latin, could take up to 6 months to publish. And then they had to be sold, and they often had to be sold to clients who were very far away on the international market, and that eroded profit because all the people who carted the books up to the market had to be paid, and the local booksellers. So again, it's always cutting down on profit. And if you vastly overestimated the print run, you could be made bankrupt by one rubbish contract. Now, pamphlets are different. They can be brought to the market within 2 days of the text arriving in the printer's shop because they're very short. So you print out 200 copies of those, and they could be sold in a week if they're Luther's works. So this means that cash flow is enormously improved by the change in the type of work that Luther was producing. And he knew that. Over half of the works he published in the first years of the Reformation are 8 pages or less. So he was writing the perfect books for the for the market, but also for the printing industry. So printing, which had, as I said, had coalesced into the major centers of population, now spread across North Germany as printing houses reopened in cities where there had not been printing for generations. And this was very much Luther's personal achievement. As I said, he had been proactive in recruiting publishers to come and work in Wittenberg, and he always marked up his own proofs. Even when he was at the Wartburg hiding from the Pope, the proofs of his books were sent out to him, and he marked them up and sent them back. But he didn't actually make any money from all of this activity. He left it all in the industry. Well, that's partly because he could afford to. The elector had given him his house for free. His wife was an extremely capable businesswoman. She had a market garden and a brewery so they could sell Luther beer to the local population. And there were plenty of presents coming in from admirers. So he was never short of money. So he could afford to do without making money from his written works, because he didn't want to give his opponents one more stick to beat him with, the idea that he had destroyed the unity of the church so that he could become a rich man. So he was careful to walk around that one.
But perhaps despite not accumulating personal wealth through this, it is clear in your estimation that he understood the economics of it, that he was a very, in some sense, savvy operator. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think when we talk about really what you've kind of described as a kind of second print revolution that happens in Wittenberg around Luther, the parallel to our own contemporary age, jumps off the page at you. We are ourselves living in the midst of a digital reformation where disruptions in our period really have only a few parallels in history, one of them certainly being the period that you're describing. So I'm just kind of curious, as a citizen of this digital world that is changing so quickly, and yet as an expert of another time that changed so quickly because of shifts in media, how do you understand what's happening around us today? And do you see parallels and perhaps even lessons that we in the kind of digital age can learn to embrace or avoid from knowing so well this earlier period of change?
Yeah. Well, I have very mixed feelings about digital technology, rather ironically, since I run a major digital resource in the Universal Short Title Catalogue. But I was very lucky because I sort of wrote my first synopsis of what I thought was going on in the early print world, the book in the Renaissance, at a time I wrote about media change, manuscript and print, in the time of a major change going on in our own society. And that was extremely useful because there are distinct parallels, not least the mountain of false prophecy that accompanies any media change. Every time we get a major media innovation, whether it's print or then the newspapers, the telegraph, the radio, television, digital, the doom mongers come out to predict the death of existing media. The radio would kill the newspaper, the television would kill it again, that digital would kill the book. I mean, when I started out in my career, 40 years ago, I was told very confidently that I would never write another book. Not I think because this interlocutor thought that I was particularly stupid, but simply because the technology would run away. But I can tell you of recent publications like the library book, 90% still sell as physical copies. The impact of Kindle and digital editions is relatively modest and declining. And what I think we have here is a fundamental misunderstanding of the history of communication as a process. the history of communication is cumulative rather than sequential. So when we adopt the new, we can integrate it into our lives as we have digital without abandoning the old. Whereas those who've invested in new technology have, for economic reasons, got to try and persuade us that the old is doomed. That, for instance, when print came along, manuscript was passé. When television came along, people didn't need other forms of entertainment, but it's just not the case. People always predict that the world as we know it cannot survive these new technologies, but humans are very adaptive, and we simply take the best of both worlds. And that has always been the case. When people learned to write, they didn't stop talking. Going back to the first age of communication, people handled the growth of different media opportunities. And I think that's the lesson I draw from all this, that the death of the book has been predicted so many times now. Originally, the radio was meant to kill it, and then the microfilm was meant to kill the book. Well, of course, microfilm is virtually dead, as is the CD-ROM. I think the Kindle will follow soon. So, all these pretenders to the throne of the book have come and gone, because the book is such versatile technology. It's so easy to move from one place in the text to the other. You don't have to read sequentially. I was told at a seminar that something like only about 1/10 of the books published through history have been intended to start at the beginning and read through to the end. Mostly we use them for reference. Well, of course, you can't do that with a papyrus when you have to scroll through. And what has digital reinvented? Well, it's reinvented scrolling. Yeah. So it's brought back one of the most inefficient technologies for reading and finding knowledge. So,
yeah. Well, I agree with you, and I like your point that is cumulative, as you say. And as someone sitting in a large print library, I hope that's the case. Otherwise, we're going to be in big trouble. But to take it back to Luther, it's kind of interesting in that your central thesis seems to be that his embrace and understanding of the change and ability to adapt to new media is one of the things that made him so successful. So I won't ask you to enter into the realm of theology and predict, but I would suspect that those who are also able to embrace the new while not giving up the old are those who are likely going to succeed in this kind of new age of digital media.
Yeah.
So let me ask the library question. We talked about a print library. I think you're in the National Library of Scotland right now. Is that?
I am in their special collections reading room, though in a private space in it. So I'm not entertaining all of the readers to this conversation.
What more appropriate place that we could find you today? So I'm glad. So you obviously have recently written a book about the history of the library. Interestingly, you subtitled it A Fragile History. So we could talk a little bit about why that is the case. But I suspect that you're the right person to ask about the value of things like rare book libraries these days. So I'm consistently asked as a librarian, as you suspect, how's this going to change your vocation? Are you going to have a job in a few years and these kinds of things? And yet a lot of libraries, ours in particular, but many have kind of doubled down on the print, right? We are refocusing on some might call it old school work of book collecting and physical exhibitions. I think we recognize the technology. It's enabling you and me to talk right now across the Atlantic, which is wonderful. But we're quite literally investing in the fact that there's continued value in spending time with physical resources on preserving artifacts. So let me ask cautiously, are we wrong? Is this poor investment? But more seriously, what role do rare book libraries and collections like this have in a growing digital age?
Well, can I sort of shape that and answer that question by talking about two very recent crises?
Yes, please.
Let's first of all talk about COVID, which completely reorientated for 2 years not only our work environment, but the teaching environment and the learning environment of our students and our school kids. We conducted a massive medical experiment with our youth without their permission, of forcing them to do screen work. And there's actually very little science on the relative effectiveness of reading print and reading on screen, but such as there is suggests that print is more helpful from the point of view of retention and deep knowledge, because of course online blends with a whole series of other online technologies which make few demands on the intellect and don't require any sustained engagement. And that's what's different about a book. But I think we all experienced during COVID these online conferences and committees and meetings. And yes, we can talk across the Atlantic and it's very, very good. But on the other hand, we've also experienced meeting people who we only knew on screen and them turning out to be completely different from what we thought. You know, I've not met Bo. I don't know if he's a giant of a man or he's not. You know,
he's not,
yeah. Who knows? But I do know he has a nice book collection. And so we framed ourselves with these reminders of what we wanted people to know about us, not by talking to us, but by looking behind us, which is a very interesting and rapid development. And books are the same. If you have a digital edition of a book, again, it's very convenient. I don't have to go all the way to Vienna, let's say, to read a book. But the context is completely lost. A tiny handbook in 24mo is the same as a folio when it's on screen. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You don't know what the paper's like. You don't know how easy it is to navigate through the text. It's a totally artificial way to look at a book. And people who I talk to in rare book collections say actually digitizing their stock increases traffic in their reading rooms. Because when people have gone to look at a text and find the whole thing rather fascinating, they then want to go and read the original in rare book libraries. So I predict rare book libraries will only be the beneficiaries from putting out some of their material in digital editions. So that's one crisis. The other, of course, is Ukraine. Now, this is impacted slightly differently in the United States to it has in Europe. But here we were facing genuine danger of not having enough power to have the electricity running. And yet the whole digital revolution has taken a bet that we will have on a permanent basis unlimited electric power to keep all our resources running. And that may turn out not to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful reminder. We just discovered last week a major digital collection that we rely on outside of our library that has gone offline, and it does happen. And the digital is not permanent, despite what we often think about. And I'll just reinforce what you just said in terms of a rare book library. In many ways, the experience of physically working with items is heightened for our patrons because they're not used to it, because their experience with books has been so mediated through the technology. So thank you for betting on libraries. We'll continue to invest in that way. I appreciate that. So we have another minute or so, and there actually is one question has come in from Jeff Jarvis here, and so I'm going to read that to you here. He says, I wonder whether there are clues as to whether Luther stumbled into the momentous decision to publish in the vernacular, or whether he saw from the first the importance of the decision to do so. What was his own likely view of print and its perils and power before he started publishing?
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. Nice to be able to dialogue with you. There are two tropes which run through the entire early history of print. One is when a printer is found to have printed something incendiary or illegal. He says, "It was the apprentice that did it. I was out of the print shop that day." And the other is when authors are a little cautious about whether it was a wise decision to print, let's say in the vernacular, when they say, "Oh, well, someone came and took it away from my desk when I wasn't looking." So I don't think we really need to believe that Luther didn't intend this work to get into the public domain. How he got from not being much of a published scholar to being the most radical writer of his age so quickly, I think is one of the great stories and great mysteries of the Reformation, which has really not quite been explained.
Lots of work left to do to answer those questions. So I'm going to close with two questions that come in from our friend here in Atlanta, Nick Wilding. And I'll give you two, and so you can pass or take them both, or we'll see. So Nick asked, first, what's the relationship between the birth of the Protestant pamphlet and Savonarola's pamphlet publications? And then second, was part of Luther's calculation towards short publication concerned with replacing the huge jobbing industry or indulgence market that he was destroying? So the relationship of the pamphlet to the indulgence.
I think yes to both, Nick. I think the role of Savonarola is something that people in Germany were very aware of. It's on a much smaller scale. I think we only know about 6 or 8 Savonarola pamphlets, but it's interesting that Luther would himself later edit a work by Savonarola and put it back into the public domain, because one of the problems for evangelicals is, the popes and the Catholics cry, where was your church before Luther? So finding good people, as they thought of them in the Catholic medieval church, was important to them, to give them a sort of heritage. As for indulgences, it is absolutely fascinating that so many of the printers who would, from 1518 onwards, print Luther, had previously been indulgence printers. I mean, they were faithful sons of the church until a better deal came along. And I think that's the story of, the printing press, really, that people are, there's very few people who are ideologically committed to what they're doing. Luther was the best show in town and making the most money. And so they turned to that. I should say that one of the problems with studying indulgences is that whereas the Incunabulary Short Title Catalogue has registered just about every scrap of printed matter available to 1500, the German National Bibliography made a fatal decision not to include broadsheets, so that from 1501 onwards, we don't have a reliable survey of all the single sheet printed matter, and that's what indulgence certificates are. So that although there's been some very good work done on the St. Peter's indulgence and its printed items, there's much more to be done, and there's many archives where we need to look for print. I mean, print in archives is the sort of forgotten child of the printing press, and we're going to try and do something like that with friends in America. We're going to have a conference next year and print in archives, and we'll see what people come up with.
Well, sounds like we got a lot of work ahead of us, so we're glad you're all about it, and thank you so much for your time. So we are at time. I want to thank you all for being here. We'll edit and record this and post this online for you and to share with your friends. I note that next month we'll have Reverend Dr. Pierce Carefoot, formerly of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at University of Toronto, to talk about very similar topics. So Dr. Pettegree, thank you so much for your time, for all of your work, and for all of you being here, thank you, and we'll see you next time.